Today's episode will be the final one in this series. It will feature Holocaust survivors who came from different countries. This episode will also include a synopsis of the aftermath of the war and what it led to. Our first story is about Fred Flatow. Fred was born on May 16, 1928 in East Prussia. His family had a coat business. When Fred began first grade in 1934, Adolf Hitler was in power. Fred was the only Jew at school, so he was bullied by his classmates, many of whom had already joined Hitler Youth organizations. Once Fred began second grade, his parents transferred him to a Jewish school. The Nazi Party had established itself in the town in 1929 and many of the Jews left. Fred's family business was affected by the Nazi anti-Semitic laws, but was only required to have the name changed at the time. Then, in 1939, Kristallnacht, Night of Broken Glass, occurred. Fred's father, Eric, was arrested and then released a few days afterwards. However, the family had to have identity cards to identify that they were Jewish. Then Fred and his older brother, Malfred, were sent to stay with friends in Hamburg, Germany. Then in 1939, Fred's parents' chief factory clerk betrayed them. The factory clerk planted a gun in Eric's business safe while knowing that it was illegal for Jews to own guns, and then he turned him into the police. Eric and his wife's factory was taken by the Nazis, and they were given 2 months to either emigrate or be taken to a concentration camp. So Eric organized for the family to immigrate to Chile. The Flatows left Europe and arrived in Chile a few months later. Then Fred married a woman named Ursula, who was also a survivor. In 1948, they immigrated to the U.S. Fred became an engineer in New York and worked at NASA for 22 years. Now they live in Washington, D.C. Fred is now a volunteer at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I cannot imagine what Fred's life would have been like if things had turned out differently early on. For example, if he had gone to a concentration camp, then he would have gone through unimaginable torture. Fortunately, he got out just in time. So, from a certain aspect, it was a good thing that his parents were betrayed because it gave them a chance to leave, rather than be sentenced to the torture of a concentration camp. To learn more about Fred Flatow's story, use the link in the description.
Our second story is about a young boy named Ralph Berets. Ralph was born on December 5, 1939 in Amersfoort, the Netherlands. Before he was born, his family lived comfortably in the middle class. His father worked in a fabric business with an old friend of theirs. They lived comfortably until the German invasion of the Netherlands in May 1940. Ralph's first memory of the war was being warned that the Nazis found his family's hiding place. They had to run. Ralph distinctly remembers flames and shouting. Deportations of Jews from the Netherlands started in the summer of 1942. To avoid this, the Barrett's family moved to a small cottage on a farm. The cottage was built and paid for by Ralph's father with some help from an old friend of theirs, Solomon. They peacefully lived there for almost a year. The cottage was built on a farm owned by Mr. Hendricks and his family, a Gentile family. One evening, the youngest of the Hendricks children ran over to warn the Berets that the Nazis found their hiding place. Ralph and his family left immediately and hid in a nearby ditch. They were able to hear the Nazis as they were searching the cottage. Picture 5. After they didn't find anything, they set the cottage on fire. Since the Berets didn't have anywhere else to go, they asked the Dutch underground for help. Then Ralph and his sister were hidden separately from their parents. His mother would sometimes visit where her children were hiding. She went to visit her children one day. While she was there, the Nazis came to check the house. Ralph, his mother, and his sister hid in the attic. Since his sister liked the cat, she also brought it up with them. When the Nazis were in the house, they heard noise coming from upstairs. When they went up to check what it was, her sister let the cat go and it ran past them. The Nazis thought that was what was making the noise, so they left. The Berets then hid in a chicken coop for the final year of the war. They stayed there with a total of 12 people. Life was tough when they stayed there. They had to sleep in shifts because there wasn't enough space. Also, they had to survive off of potato peels and outer leaves of white cabbage. On special occasions, such as birthdays, Ralph received an egg. When the war was over, they tried to get their house back, but some German officers were living in it. It took the Berets 6 weeks to reclaim their property. In 1951, they moved it to the U.S. Ralph became a professor at the University of Missouri and is a volunteer at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. This story shows a very young boy during World War II. He had to live in some very uncomfortable situations. It is sad that he had to go through that at such a young age, but it is also amazing that he survived and is now a teacher and a volunteer.
Our next story is about a proud Holocaust survivor named Irene Fogel Weiss. Irene lived in Behr, Czechoslovakia, where she lived a low-income but relatively peaceful life with her parents. But when she was only 8 years old, Czechoslovakia became part of Hungary. This is important because Hungary was allied with the Nazis, and with the Nazis came ruthless fascism against the Jewish families like Irene's. Irene's family was forced to hide from the masses, which laws now did not protect them against. Eventually, Germany called for the roundup of Jews in Hungary to Auschwitz, and nearly 500,000 were taken. When Irene got to Auschwitz, she and her family believed it to be a work camp, Irene saying that if we can work, it can't be such a dreadful place. Auschwitz was built to deceive its victims, masquerading as a work camp, but it was actually a way to systematically kill and torture Jews. Irene was separated from her parents and would later go on to know that they were killed in the gas chambers. Irene was stationed at crematorium number 4, witnessing people entering and never coming out. She was forced into labor with her sister and faced terrible conditions. Eventually, Irene was freed from the death camp, and she and her sister were the only 2 children in her town to survive. Irene is still alive today and has 3 grandchildren. According to Irene, "This is my last chance that tragedy is not forgotten." World War II Digital Archive logo image. Irene is a courageous and influential survivor who withstood the horrid and depraved attacks of the Nazis. If I was in her situation, I probably would have died or wanted to die.
Our last story is about Robert Behr from Berlin, Germany. He and his family were affected by some of the events that happened during the Holocaust. Robert Behr was born March 1st, 1922 in Berlin, Germany, and lived with his mother and stepfather. His family was affected by the Nuremberg laws and other anti-Semitic laws that Hitler inflicted in 1933. These laws made Jews have to carry around identification cards, and Jewish children were not allowed to go to school. After this, things started going downhill for Robert's family. November 9th through the 10th in 1938, during the Night of Broken Glass, Robert's father was arrested and sent to Buchenwald concentration camp. He got released a couple days later and immigrated to the United States. On November 29th, 1938, Robert and his parents got evicted from their apartment. With help from the Jewish Community Service, they found an apartment to live in. In 1942, Robert's mother and stepfather were arrested for helping someone escape to neutral Switzerland. Robert also got arrested 2 days later, and his family was sent to Berets. There, Robert transported bodies for burial, then worked on the road crew until later he found work in the kitchen. The restaurant rapidly got overcrowded, and they started deporting people to Auschwitz. Robert wanted to protect his family, so he volunteered to work on the SS headquarters at Fogel. During a really bad winter, supply problems stalled their work ethic, so they were forced to wash the trees. January 1945, Robert got reunited with his family at Berets. He worked there in the kitchen until he was liberated by the Soviet Army on May 5, 1945. In 1947, Robert immigrated to the U.S. and enlisted in the Army. He hoped to get assigned to Berlin so he could help out his mother. Thanks to his German fluency, he was able to do so. He left the Army in 1952 and joined the Air Force Civil Service in Dayton as an intelligence officer. He retired in 1988 and had a bachelor's and a master's in modern European history and became a professor at Sinclair College. He's been a volunteer at the United States Holocaust Museum since 2001. Robert died December of 2018. Robert's story is important because it helps viewers learn about events in life during the Holocaust. It is also important that we read and learn about these stories because one day we won't have survivors to tell us their stories.
Following the war and the victory for the Allies, the Big Three, which were Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, and Harry Truman, met at the Potsdam Conference to negotiate terms for the end of World War II. In order to work towards peace, the Allied powers formed the United Nations. The countries that fought alongside Hitler lost territory and had to pay war reparations. Then Germany was split into 4 zones that were occupied by Britain, the US, the Soviet Union, and France. This would lead to tensions between the Soviets and the Western world, eventually separating Germany and Berlin into East and West Germany, as well as East and West Berlin. The Soviets started to take over Eastern Europe, which led to the Cold War. This would also lead to the infamous Berlin Wall. In Japan, many were still suffering from the effects of the atomic bombs. Japan was still undergoing large changes to its government and social structure. During the Nuremberg trials, the Nazis were punished for their war crimes. This episode's theme was Holocaust survivors from different countries. Having these stories on the World War II Digital Archive will honor and preserve the experiences of these survivors. These stories will help people today who are interested in World War II or are just wanting to learn more. They will also help future generations understand and sympathize with these people. With this understanding, they can further their knowledge on the subject of World War II and use it to form connections. To learn more about World War II or any of these stories, please refer to the description. Make sure to like and subscribe and watch our previous videos. Thank you.